The US is gaining ground, spreading out across North America. The economy is booming. In the south, there's cotton. In the north, industry. But the new nation is divided. In a land where all men are created equal, 4 million black Americans live as slaves. And it's tearing the nation apart. It's 1825. Across the world, the modern era is being born. The Industrial Revolution has reached America. In upstate New York, a man-made river is cutting through the wilderness. The Erie Canal is one of the biggest construction projects in the Western world in 4,000 years. Nearly 500 kilometers long and dug by hand, there's not a single qualified engineer on the project or in the country. But that's not holding the canal builders back.
I think of the spirit of America being imagination combined with tenacity. There's a strong work ethic, a wonderful freedom of creation combined with the mental, muscle, and physical labor. So to me, it represents the best of the human spirit.
But the landscape doesn't always cooperate. A wall of solid limestone, nearly 20 meters high, and another 50 more kilometers of virgin territory, stands between the diggers and Lake Erie. The canal will link the Atlantic Ocean to the middle of America. It will change where people can live and why, turning the North into a global economic powerhouse. The man behind the canal is New York Governor DeWitt Clinton. Born to wealth, he won't take no for an answer. He wants to be President of the United States. Instead, he runs New York for 20 years.
America was blessed with many inspirational leaders, and I think DeWitt Clinton had a real sense of how important New York could be for America.
Clinton's vision is to make New York rich. The press thinks the canal is a dangerous and expensive waste of time. They call it Clinton's Big Ditch. Clinton thinks otherwise.
It is a work more stupendous, more magnificent, and more beneficial than has hitherto been achieved by the human race.
Entrepreneurship is about doing things where you don't know what it's going to look like, you don't know what it's going to be made of, you just have this instinct that you can do it and it'll work. Those guys had visions and did it.
50,000 men dig out 11 million cubic yards of rock. Many Irish immigrants find work on the crews. David Gilroy makes 5 times what he can make back home, but it's hazardous work. There's only one way to cut through the rock face: gunpowder. A highly combustible mix of nitrate charcoal and sulfur. The wrong proportions can be lethal. There's only one job that's more dangerous than lighting the fuse: going back to relight it. cope, workers drink. Whiskey calms the nerves and clouds the brain. An English tourist can't believe the crews mix alcohol and explosives.
The Irish labourers grew so reckless of life that at the signal for blasting, they would just hold their shovels over their heads.
I think when you're brought up in America, you're brought up on the history of hard work. There's so many immigrants that have died to build this country. That's in our bloodstream, that's in our DNA as Americans. We don't want their lives to go in vain. Because of that, we usually work harder than anybody else.
8 years of digging, nearly 1,000 lives lost. The Erie Canal costs more than $100 million today. The canal opens in 1825. $15 million of goods begin to flow along its length every year. Villages along the canal become prosperous cities. Goods plunge in price. The frontier is flooded with new commodities and ships its goods back to new markets. New York City becomes a boom town. Wall Street takes off as a global financial center. The city quadruples in size and becomes the nation's #1 port. The trade boom creates so much wealth that in 1840, the word millionaire is invented. Today, 80% of the upstate population of the state of New York still lives within 40 kilometers of the canal. Hundreds of kilometers to the south, a small plant is creating another economic boom. Cotton. But its rapid spread will plant the seeds of war. Tropical cotton flourishes in America's southern states. Its valuable soft fibers are easy to grow. But processing cotton is labor-intensive. By hand, separating seeds from fiber in a couple of kilos of raw cotton could take a whole day. A simple patent filed on the 4th of March 1794 changes that. The cotton gin. By automating the process, it deeply divides the country.
The cotton gin transformed not only America, but the world. The concept of mass production using a machine just exploded everywhere.
A single worker can now process 50 times more cotton per day. Output multiplies across the South. By 1830, America is producing half the world's cotton. By 1850, it's nearly 3/4. Called white gold, cotton supports a new lavish lifestyle in the South. By 1850, there are more millionaires per capita in Natchez, Mississippi than anywhere else on Earth. The town's richest man owns 40,000 acres. The South is thriving, but its wealth is built on the back of slavery. The industrial North is complicit in the South's success. It profits from cotton, but turns a blind eye to slavery. The founding fathers, many of them slave owners, assumed slavery would disappear. It has been abolished in Britain for 20 years and is outlawed across Europe. But with the cotton explosion, slavery becomes critical to the economy of the South. Slaves are now up to 5 times more valuable than before the invention of the cotton gin.
People don't really realize this, but slavery was actually on the decline in the South prior to the invention of the cotton gin. But then once the cotton gin made it so practical to grow cotton, all of a sudden every farmer in the South wanted to plant as much cotton as possible.
But overproduction is destroying the land. So cotton heads west in search of fertile soil, bringing slavery with it. Anti-slavery forces in the north want to keep the frontier free. The stage is set for the first battles in the war over slavery. In the 1850s, the cotton boom transforms America. But it's a time bomb. The rural South grows it, the industrial North turns it into fabric. And both profit. The boom is fueled on a new machine, the power loom. Raw cotton comes in, finished cloth goes out, all under one roof. The modern factory is born. Lowell, Massachusetts is called the City of Spindles, a textiles boom town. Its population explodes from 200 in 1820 to nearly 20,000 in just 15 years. More than a third of the town works in the mills. 85% are single women between 15 and 25. Harriet Robinson is 10. When her father dies, she goes to work at the mill.
I can see myself now, racing down the alley, between the spinning frames and carrying in front of me a bobbin box, bigger than I was.
It's a new way for young women to make money. Harriet's wages help support her family. Industrialization is changing lives.
Oh, the mill girls make good use of their money. The mortgage is lifted from the homestead, the farmhouse is painted. Mill girls help maintain widowed mothers and drunken or invalid fathers. We were paid $2 a week. Oh, how proud I was when it came to my turn to stand upon the bobbin box.
When women really joined the workforce in the cotton mills and the thread factories, I think it gave women an opportunity to get out, be serious about being breadwinners, and it changed the whole fabric of America.
The mills also revolutionize how Americans dress. Previously, most families made their own clothes. Now people buy cheaper, ready-to-wear. Eastern fashions replaced buckskin. By 1850, men's clothing is the largest manufacturing industry in New York City.
For me, what makes me proudest to be an American is that American spirit of productivity, optimism, this idea that the world doesn't have to be doom and gloom, that we can use technology to make our lives better.
Fashion isn't the only innovation to come out of the mills. Technology used here will lead straight to Silicon Valley. Looms pioneer punch cards to produce patterned fabric. Each hole in the card tells the loom to use a different colored thread, a yes-no decision. It's binary code, the basis of all modern computers. The birth of the computer begins in cotton mills.
You know, in every major development, I think, in the history of America, technology has been at the center of it.
Despite 12-hour shifts, the factories offer a new world of opportunity for women. They're reading more, talking more, educating themselves.
Yeah, reading books on factory time was against the rules. But we hid books in apron pockets and waste baskets. Oh, and sometimes we pasted poems on our looms to memorize.
And together, they begin to make their voices heard. In October 1836, women from the Lowell mills gather after work and organize. Their protest against wage cuts is one of the first strikes in U.S. history. And they will win. The mill bosses back down. A generation of young women go on to become teachers, writers, and college graduates. Harriet Robinson will become a leading suffragette and petition Congress for the right of women to vote. Their secret meetings are illuminated by lamps fueled by an extraordinary creature.
Whale oil opened up the night, and like so many really transformative technological innovations, it expanded human freedom. It created a way for people to get more, do more, and achieve more.
It'll be 20 years before the discovery of crude oil. Until then, America runs on oil from whales.
The whaling industry helped invent part of the kind of industrial revolution, and the classic American workaholic, work around the clock kind of environment, where if you had more light to keep you going in those dark winter days, you could get more done, you could make more money, and you could kind of drive the economy forward.
Whaling becomes another boom industry. Up to 180 tons and more than 30 meters long, a single whale can produce up to 11 cubic meters of oil. Even today, whale oil is used by NASA. The Hubble Space Telescope runs on it. Whaling becomes one of the North's biggest industries, bringing in $11 million a year. But the human cost is high. Half of all whaling ships will be lost at sea. Few men are willing to take the risk. But it's an opportunity for African Americans. 20,000 free men and escaped slaves take to the seas. John Thompson is a runaway slave.
I have a family in Philadelphia, but fearing to remain there any longer, I thought I would go on a whaling voyage where I stood least chance of being arrested by slave hunters.
The equal opportunity offered in whaling is ahead of its time.
Here, a colored man is only known and looked upon as a man, and is promoted in rank according to his ability and skill to perform the same duties as a white man.
The whaling industry offered an ex-slave like John Thompson the possibility of social and economic fluidity, mobility, and acceptance in a way, even in the North, that was not possible for black people otherwise.
The man on the lookout cried out, "There she blows!" There were 4 whales in sight, not more than 3/4 of a mile distant.
The whalers used state-of-the-art harpoons, invented by ex-slave Lewis Temple. The kill can take hours.
The whale can only be killed by lancing him under the fin, which is a work of much skill and practice. A monster, terrible in his fury, able to shiver the boat in atoms by one stroke of his tail.
Yet even the dangers at sea are preferable to the horror of life as a slave. And dire punishment awaits any slave who risks escape to freedom. 1841, New Orleans, the heart of the slave trade.
How much?
It's auction day. In the first half of the 19th century, over 500,000 slaves will be sold at auction. It's a business worth $2 billion to the Southern economy. Since the cotton boom, the value of slaves has skyrocketed. Now men cost over $1,000, women $800, children $500. Solomon Northup, an educated free man from the North, was kidnapped into slavery.
Go, boy, you come over here.
He would make us hold up our heads, walk us briskly back and forth, while customers would feel our hands and arms and bodies. Make us open up our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for or purchase. Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his sale.
90% of all African Americans are slaves. 4 million men, women, and children.
We had based this country on everyone having inalienable rights to freedom and equality, and yet we created a system of abject persecution.
Slaves are fattened for auction. Dark-skinned men are bought for the fields, light-skinned women for the house. Traders lie about their ages, even dyeing a slave's gray hairs.
For the plantation owners, it was like just going to your local supermarket to get sugar or flour. They had become so desensitized to the humanity of the slave that they did not see them as human beings.
Buyers demand the most fertile slaves for breeding. The most expensive are light-skinned teenage virgins. Rape is common. Eliza's being sold with her 2 children, Emily and Randall. In Louisiana, it's illegal for children under 11 to be taken from their parents.
Boy, come over here.
But it happens all the time.
You know, 140 years is not a really long time in the context of history. So it's hard for me to believe that blacks didn't have any rights here. They weren't treated as human beings. They were treated like animals, essentially.
So please.
All right, you go. Measure their business,
Oh, my love.
Over half the sales at auction will tear a family apart.
If you've ever been 8, to think of being separated from your mother and your father and sold and you'll never see them again. The horror of that, the poignancy of all of that, and yet that's the kind of thing that happened across the South up until the end of slavery.
Okay, my final offer. 1,000 for that man. Yeah. 900 for that man. The woman there, $700.
Please, buy my child. Sir!
I have seen mothers kissing for the last time the faces of their dead offspring, but never have I seen such an exhibition of intense grief as when Eliza was parted from her child.
Come on, now, you go.
On board a train heading north, a slave is on the run. The risk of capture is high. At most, 1,000 men and women a year are successful. Common punishments, if caught, include branding, the slashing of Achilles tendons, and ears cut off. Frederick Douglass has already failed twice. But he has a better chance than most of passing as a free man. Unlike 80% of slaves, he can read and write.
even in the 21st century. We're only 3 or 4 generations away from people that not only could not get paid for their labor, it was against the law for them to read and write, it was against the law for them to marry, it was against the law for them to name their children after themselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, please. Way to go.
Black Americans must carry documents proving they're free or who they belong to. Frederick Douglass carries papers borrowed from a friend. But they won't hold up to careful examination.
My whole future depended on the decision of this conductor. This moment of time was one of the most anxious I ever experienced. Had he looked closely at the paper, he could not have failed to discover that it called for a very different looking person from myself.
Frederick Douglass makes it to New York City and freedom. He'll become a leading figure in the anti-slavery movement and even debate with President Lincoln in the White House. Douglass will become the most famous African American of his time. Many escaped slaves use a network of secret routes called the Underground Railway. Harriet Tubman is its most famous operator. An escaped slave herself, she risks her life returning south again and again to guide others to freedom. Tubman will do anything to avoid capture, even keeping babies quiet with opium.
Harriet Tubman is the Moses of our people. She was a wanted woman. She was a hated woman, reviled by the white South. Just imagine you have gotten out of slavery, you've escaped, and yet you come back. You have the courage and the care about other people to come back into a hell.
The South puts a reward on her head, but nothing stops her, not even a $40,000 bounty.
Come on, y'all. Come on. Move. I'm gonna die.
Tubman is one of America's first civil rights activists. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman threaten everything the South stands for.
Tens of thousands of slave owners had to deal with for the first time the fact that these people are going to rebel. She was far more effective as the symbol that they feared than the few hundred that she saved.
Nearly 60,000 slaves will escape, up to a $50 million loss for their owners. And growing opposition to slavery means the South will have to fight to preserve its way of life. The battle for the soul of a nation has begun. At the midpoint of the 19th century, America enters the modern world. In 20 years, there will be Levi jeans, chewing gum, and hot dogs. But the nation is split ideologically between North and South.
Slavery became not simply a political issue, not simply an economic issue, but a moral issue as well. It became the issue that defined North and South in the 1850s.
In September 1850, a new fugitive slave law brings the brutality of Southern slavery to the North. No African American is safe anywhere in the U.S.
Gentlemen, you've made a mistake. There's a place of business. I'm a tailor to my clients. I'm a free man. I'm not a slave, gentlemen.
Fugitive slave law meant that if you were a slave and you managed to escape to the North, your master could come and get you, and you had no recourse. Not only that, if you were a free Negro, they still could sell you down the river.
The search for runaway slaves escalates into a witch hunt. A simple accusation can condemn an African American, escaped slave or free. Federal magistrates get $10 to rule they are slaves, only $5 to set them free. The new law causes outrage. Abolitionist newspapers and tracts spread across the North. In 1852, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, an unknown Connecticut housewife, becomes the best-selling book of the century after the Bible. Its passionate anti-slavery message appeals especially to women, many now politicized for the first time. Slavery is the burning issue of the day.
The Northerners began to see that, wait a minute, they're not going to keep slavery just in the South. They want to take slavery west and to turn the country into a slave country.
As new settlers flood into the frontier territories, each becomes a battleground. In Kansas, a peaceful protest turns violent. Towns are terrorized, stores robbed, homesteads burned. Neither North nor South will back down. One man will stop at nothing in his quest to abolish slavery. John Brown becomes a folk hero in the North and a terrorist to the South. He believes himself to be God's chosen instrument. He will stop at nothing for his cause.
John Brown is one of those controversial figures about whom almost anything you can say is true. He's a terrorist in our modern terms. He's a revolutionary.
The divide between North and South is an open wound. Kansas bleeds for 2 years. More than 200 are killed. America is on the road to war.
America is built on a number of distinct fault lines. One, of course, was slavery and freedom. That was a fault line that had to be addressed.
In the South, slavery is a way of life, even for non-slave owners. Anti-slavery forces in the North threaten what many regard as their birthright.
There is still, in some areas of America, a great pride in being Southern and holding true to the original Southern attitude. I think our clinging to the idea that slavery is a right and just way of life, it is a dark spot in our history.
Anger in the South grows every day. The North claims the moral high ground, but it's getting rich from cotton too.
Pretty much everybody agreed that a crisis was developing. Not everyone knew that the crisis would include, in the end, a civil war, but everyone understood that a showdown between the slave South and the free North was about to occur.
In October 1859, the actions of radical abolitionist John Brown escalates the crisis. He prepares to take the fight to the heart of the South and plans to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's the biggest collection of weapons in the South. 20,000 rifles, muskets, and pistols. Brown wants to arm the slaves and lead a slave rebellion. Fighting alongside him are his 5 sons, all willing to die for their cause. The arsenal is poorly defended. Breaking in is easy. But Brown's plan depends on slaves joining the fight. He needs a small army to carry off so many weapons. Without slave reinforcements, it's a suicide mission. When word gets out, local townspeople attack the arsenal. Not a single slave joins Brown and his men. Trapped, they must fight for their lives.
I want to free all Negroes in the state. I have possession of the United States Armory. And if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood.
1859, radical abolitionist John Brown attempts to inspire a slave revolt. None have joined him, and now he's trapped. At dawn, the U.S. Marines arrive. They storm the arsenal under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown and his men decide to fight. The soldiers overwhelm them. But this is just the beginning of the fight against slavery. John Brown survives and is captured, but his sons are dead. His trial captivates the country. Charged as a criminal, he puts the institution of slavery on trial. Brown is convicted of treason and sentenced to death. A terrorist in the South, a martyr in the North. He's executed on December 2nd, 1859. As the country prepares to elect a new president in 1860, many wonder if the nation can survive.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood.
In Chicago, on May the 18th, 1860, an unlikely candidate wins the Republican Party's nomination for president. Abraham Lincoln's only claim to fame is he's lost 2 elections to the Senate. Lincoln hates slavery, but he's desperate to hold the country together.
What I admire about Abraham Lincoln is that he had his beliefs, and he stuck to his beliefs at a time when it wasn't popular to do so, especially when it was black, white, and very cut and dry. He stuck to his beliefs.
When the country goes to the polls on November 6th, 1860, the stakes are high. Lincoln is elected president of a nation on the brink of civil war. Convinced he'll abolish slavery, the South rebels. Southern states threaten to leave the Union. The North backs Lincoln, but in southern cities like Atlanta, the papers talk of war.
Let the consequences be what they may. Whether the Potomac is crimsoned in human gore, and Pennsylvania Avenue is paved 10 fathoms with mangled bodies, the South will never submit to such humiliation and degradation as the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln.
The South knew that Lincoln was going to win, and it was just a matter of time, tick, 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 before secession occurred.
The South wants no part of a union with Lincoln in the White House. But as he prepares to take office, Lincoln is still determined to avoid a civil war.
Lincoln was not happy about slavery. He did not see that as congruent to all men are created equal. And he had given a speech before he ever became president on why that was so important to him. And I think that was coming to a head, and when he got elected, that was the final straw for the South.
On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. The 10 other slave states soon follow. As Lincoln celebrates victory, the shadow of war falls across America. In February 1861, a few weeks before his inauguration, the Confederate States of America are born.
Lincoln's principal objective was to save the Union, and then we'll deal with slavery. But before too long, he had to both save the Union and deal with slavery.
Lincoln receives his first death threats before ever taking office. He'll save everyone in a file labeled assassination. On the journey to Washington, he'll wear a disguise just to be safe. To avoid war, he proposes a compromise.
It is Lincoln who explains the case for freedom and says, I'm not going to attack slavery where it is, but I'm not going to let it expand.
At his inauguration, Abraham Lincoln reluctantly pledges that states with slaves will be allowed to keep them, but it's too little, too late. A virtual state of war already exists. The South mobilizes an army of 800,000 men against a Union army of 2.5 million. 5 weeks later, the first shots ring out between the states. The Civil War will be the deadliest in American history. In the next 4 years, more lives will be lost than in all America's other wars put together.